Hey, thanks for being a part of the conversation. Let's do some pod crashing. Episode number 321 is with Steve Fishman and Dax Devlin Ross from the podcast, The Burden.
Great. Thank you, Arrow.
How you doing, Arrow?
Fantastic.
Thanks for having us.
Right from the very beginning, we need to let listeners know that this is not a made-up story, that you guys really did your homework, and this is a true story, and that even though it sounds really way out there, it's real.
It's absolutely real, and we got 4 years to prove it.
we had 4 years. Oh, we had 3 babies in the midst of making this. So not us together, obviously, but the fact of the matter is that we had 3 babies. No, this was we bring the goods. Yeah. We bring the goods in this one. And I think that's a distinguishing characteristic in terms of, we're not passively telling a story here. This is an active story. This is as Steve likes to say it all the time, this is propulsive. We're driving through this and we're on our own journey. And we're sort of learning as the listener learns as well.
Let your listeners know that if they love Law and Order, well, this is the real story.
One of the things that I found so fascinating about this, and maybe it's just the radio guy in me, but your voices match so well. They're perfectly paced out. I mean, have you guys worked together a lot over the years to be able to have harmony like that?
Steve, that's hilarious. Thank you, first of all. Thank you. But what do you think? What is your answer to that question, Steve? I want to know how you answer that.
Well, I want to get into the fact that we're very different. I have told I have a New Yorkie accent, which, I think is a code word for other things. But, I'm a white guy, grew up in the suburbs, been in Brooklyn for a long time. And I'm a bar owner on a dead-end street, which, by the way, Detective Scarcella used to patrol. And I come into this because that block where my bar was particularly violent. In fact, the bar ends because of a murder. And I enter this thinking, you know what? I need the cops. I need a tough cop like Detective Scarcella, who, by the way, had a superhero nickname, the Hulk. And Dax enters this story through a very different.
I mean, I'm a black guy, grew up in the 90s, and I identify as someone who's had his own experiences with the law. I have, with the wrong side of the criminal justice system. And I'm a lawyer, but at the same time, I live in a body that is over-policed and has been experienced being over-policed. So I'm a criminal justice and investigative journalist, and I've always explored the system through the lens of those who've been wrongfully treated by the system. So for me, coming to this story was I wanted to understand and interrogate this Scarcella character. And I honestly, be honest, I came into it with some hard feelings relative to someone like him. And it was a journey for me to sit down with him for many, many hours over several years to ask him questions and to understand. And I won't give it away, but I think the thing that maybe you're also sensing is that the two of us, Steve and I, both were friends. I mean, this is my guy. We came deep, but we also opened ourselves up to being on a journey with each other to learn and not just come into this with a judgment and a decision already having been made.
Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the things that we do in The Burden is we invite listeners to take this journey with us. We're learning things as we go along. We learn about the character and background of really one of the heroes, the kind of elite jailhouse lawyer. He's a guy who tells us at one point, I would lie in my own self-interest, And so what do you do with that? Well, you say to yourself, that's what Detective Scarcella thinks about him. But, he emerges as a guy, well, let's say a guy with a lot of other sides, and I think it's the same that's true of Detective Scarcella. He's a guy who really feels like he did good. And I think we can stipulate, as lawyers would say, and this is to Dax, that he did do a lot of good. At the same time, he's a guy who operated in a moment when the marching order was get the bad guys off the street by whatever means necessary. And one of the things that we learn is that Detective Scarcella was a guy with a deep sense of justice that did not always comport with the regulations put down by the police department.
And I'll say we didn't answer your darn question, and I want to just make sure you. So the answer, I'm going to put a really fine point on it. Over the course of several years, we had to learn how to be co-hosts on this journey.
Yeah.
And there were, by the end, we're reading scripts that say version 33.
Oh, no.
and I'll leave it at that.
The part of the magic of The Burden on iHeartRadio is the fact that I love the way that you bring in that New York accent and attitude, because down here in the South, we hear that accent. It's like, ooh, those darn New Yorkers.
Yeah. There is nobody more New York than Detective Louis Scarcella. I mean, and one of the things we do is we set out to get Louis Scarcella, who had been a no comment guy for the past decade. And, we kind of go through a New York, what did the Navy SEALs go through? That's Hell Week.
Or hazing. You could say a hazing.
Hazing, yeah. Scarcella invites me to his favorite Russian bath, where he beats me in the sauna with oak leaves,
Not me, mind you. I was not going to do that, but,
No, Dax has so much more dignity than I have in it. That's one reason it works so well. I have to jump in the freezing Atlantic, and finally Louis Scarcella says, you passed the test.
Wow.
But Scarcella he comes into the studio then, and he tells, listen, he's a New Yorker from Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, an Italian enclave. His uncle is a big-time mobster who, by the way, Scarcella investigates for murder. One confession he could not get. Scarcella was a guy who was, and you won't believe this, he was a carnival barker at Coney Island.
Whoa.
While he's a first-grade detective, it's come on in, come on over. Every contestant a winner. You got to be, what was his spiel? But, he's that guy. You cannot get more New York than Louis Scarcella.
Did it start off as a good thing? In other words, he started breaking these crimes, and the thing is that you become addicted to that because all of a sudden you're being looked at differently. And so, did he do things in order to get attention?
Can I just do it? So I think what we try to stay away from, but we invite our audiences to do, is engaging in the sort of psychological sort of reconstruction of the why. And at the same time, what you're naming is entirely plausible insofar as he was, a guy being featured in the newspapers. He was a guy who was being sort of identified as the closer. And we all know what happens when we begin to be seen by our peers in a way. Like, we can't get a confession. Call in our guy. You want to deliver the goods. This is part of your identity now. And I think what's explored in this is the extent to which his identity merges, like who he is becomes very much steeped in this ability to solve the toughest crimes, such that I don't even know to this day if he's able to step outside of it and recognize how he might have been fallible and how he might have not necessarily always done the right thing in service of his ego.
And in service of his view of justice. Listen, one of the things that I just want to mention here is that Scarcella, he was a creative player in this. And that's one of the things that he's very proud of. I mean, this was a guy who could get the confession. That was his superpower. He goes on Dr. Phil and explains how he can do that, a choice that he regretted until probably more than any other until he heard this podcast. But he was a guy who would he would cry with suspects. He would pray with suspects.
Oh, wow.
He would spend hours and hours with suspects. He would put his arm around them. He was the father they never had. He was the priest confessor. He tells the story of being on an airplane with a suspect, transporting a suspect who's sitting between him and another cop in shackles, shackled to his seat. Scarcella has the stewardess. Back then there were just stewardesses, and come over and whisper in his ear. And then he turns to the suspect and he says, well, I got to take your shackles off because we're going to come into rough weather. And we may go down, and I got to give you a chance to save your life. And Scarcella's story is and then he gives it up. Now, you might ask yourself, why is a guy faced with crashing and dying in the water decide that that's the moment to give it up? But Scarcella's answer when I asked him that was, well, he did. He did. But I have to tell you, I love the coda to this story because, as Scarcella tells it, he, the other detective, and quote unquote, the bad guy go into the airport bar on landing and they all have shots.
Yeah.
And as Dak says in the podcast, what is the suspect celebrating?
I'm glad that you had a Frenchie introduced in the story very early because I mean that gave me a better picture of what was going on with it, and it drew me even closer to the storyline itself. And I mean, and then to read about the how I believe it was her own mother that was taken in to identify somebody in the line, and the number 2 comes up, and I'm going, I never even thought about that. That body language can serve as a decision maker for other people.
Yeah. I mean, you highlight that as a sort of. Thank you for noticing that. I think first of all, Frenchie deserves all the credit in the world for her work, and that this is in many ways she's a huge reason why. I also was drawn to the fact of her ability to express vulnerability around her own blind spots, her own sort of like prejudices, if you will, and the ability and using that to help her change and open up and explore. And I think that's kind of what we're hoping that readers or listeners do in their own process, that we can hold a certain assumption, and when new information comes into our consciousness, what do we do with that? I think for her, what she did was I think she decides that she's going to use that energy, that New York energy, to become a feisty fighter for justice through her pen, through her storytelling. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, to me, one of the things that I find was profound about it. That's her motivation. She told us that that's her origin story. Her origin story for her why is that moment, is her own experience. And that's a critical thing, I think, to connect with and around all of these, because Louis has an origin story. Derek has an origin story. Shabaka has an origin story. And we get into all of these through the course of this podcast.
And I'm glad you brought out Frenchie, because we all love Frenchie. I mean, what a nickname. Francis Rose, known around the New York Times as Frenchie. It's like a film noir nickname. The story that we tell, we go back to her childhood, and she's a Puerto Rican woman from Queens, and that's who she is. She's this fierce, tough woman who sees herself as fierce and tough. And she tells the story about being a Puerto Rican girl growing up in a neighborhood that's largely Italian, certainly not Puerto Rican. She's got one best friend who's another Puerto Rican girl, and they're picked on by this. This is the 6th grade. They're picked on by this one kid. Where's your switchblade Puerto Ricans? So one day, these 2 6th grade girls go to the guy's house, the guy being another 6th grader, knock on the door. His mother calls the 6th grader down and says, "Oh, you've got a visitor." And as Frenchie tells us, and then the two of us beat the crap out of Anthony right in front of his mother. Frenchie is just this tough girl from the get-go. And as I like to say, I say in The Burden, she's going to save your life at your peril. She goes into jail. She sits with this guy who she becomes convinced is wrongfully convicted. And he is certainly convinced he's wrongfully convicted, but he's coming up for parole. And, in parole, you got to admit you did the crime. Yeah. You can't admit the crime if you're telling a New York Times reporter, I'm innocent. So he says to Frenchie, is this going to mess up my parole? And Frenchie says something that she admits she never should have said, but she said it and repeats it to us. She says to the guy who's facing this tough decision, she says, no, this isn't going to mess up your parole. This is going to get you exonerated. Ooh. Now, for a reporter to promise that is just crazy, but that's her fact.
We can think of a couple other words to describe that, but it worked out favorably, but it was definitely a risk, reputational and otherwise.
How much of the revisions did you go through in order to build up that scene with Frenchie getting that story, and she had to break it down and figure out what the connection was between the convicts? Because I mean, to me, I felt stress while they, and what she must have been going through, because they had to figure out what that connection was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's an incredible scene
Yeah.
that we teased out. It took us a long time because, we were interviewing individual players. This Frenchie, the heads of this jailhouse law firm, and they, really did fashion in the law firm in prison. And suddenly what happens in prison is that there's a light bulb that goes off, a kind of eureka moment when one of the inmates, this is Derek, looks at the motion of the another inmate, this is Shabaka, and these two quote unquote partners in the law firm realize, oh my God, they use stronger language, but oh my God, the same cop framed us. And that changes the course of New York legal history.
Yeah.
Because these guys take it away. Dax is a lawyer, so I'm going to let him explain.
No, I'll explain the legality, but I think as it relates to this question of that moment, I think you're so right in sort of understanding like the construction of the scene, the construction of the story in general was challenging because we're toggling between different time frames a lot. There's a whole set of things that sort of kicks off during a DA race that is sort of the context in which Frenchie is doing all of this isn't just sort of happening abstractly. It's happening within a very politically heated environment. If she had probably tried to, escalate that story a decade earlier, it would have gotten no traction. But she's escalating this story and she's having these revelations in the midst of this heated race between a white 20-year incumbent Brooklyn DA and an upstart young black, criminal defense attorney who's highly celebrated and who wants to be the champion of wrongful convictions. And here she sits this story sort of in the mix of all of this. So we're trying to tell a story that doesn't lose our listeners and helps them kind of sit inside a time frame, but it doesn't also hold it down and lock it down so much that we can sort of get mired in it. So to your point, there's a production challenge of trying to orchestrate those moments. But to this broader point Steve is raising up around these convicted felons who, for the entirety of their prison sentence, maintain their innocence, it's just how powerful and important it is that they both found themselves but found the law, and how they weren't just sort of garden variety guys who sort of stumbled in. These very well could have been dudes who became high-powered attorneys, judges, law professors themselves had their lives gone in a different direction. Their ability to understand the language of the law and then to utilize it in their favor isn't just like interesting. It is brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
One of the things I love about that story is that they really form a brotherhood, and they have different roles. Derek is the intellectual leader. He lectures on a whiteboard about legal procedure, and these guys sit around taking notes. You got Shabaka, who's he's a terrific writer. He has this phrase that we fell in love with. He says, in emotion, he says, it is a extreme possibility that Scarcella did not always commit pristine police work. A fabulously understated line. And I think maybe both of our favorite character is the guy who's the youngest, who also had Scarcella in his case.
Yeah.
But we dubbed the intern. Listen, we saw this as a bit of an Ocean's 11 scene. Everybody had their roles. They came together. They planned. It wasn't a caper, unless you think of a kind of jailbreak. And the intern made the coffee. This guy, Nelson, the young guy. How do you make coffee in prison, in a cell? Well, he has been sent some Bustelo coffee by his family. He takes a sock, which he tells us is a clean sock. He puts the grains of coffee in the sock and uses it as a strainer.
Oh my God.
To make coffee, and to make coffee for Derek, who's 2 jail cells away, typing into the night. He rolls up his mattress. He sits on the mattress. He puts his typewriter on the steel frame of the bed, typing. He's typing a motion for the intern to try and get his freedom. So the intern hooks the coffee up to a bed sheet, and Derek then slides it down 2 cells. And the idea is to keep Derek fueled into the night so he can keep writing. So, you got a whole, listen, it's cinematic.
I love it.
Yeah.
You guys have got to come back to this show anytime in the future. The door is always going to be open for you.
Well, thank you. That's so nice to hear.
Thank you so much for this. And it really is. It's great theater of the mind, too, what you guys are doing. So I can't thank you enough for that.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having us.
Well, you be brilliant today, you two, okay?
All right. Likewise.
Talk soon. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.